We once believed that humans were at the centre of the universe. For centuries, we thought that we were at the centre of the biological kingdom. And now, perhaps we must accept that we're no longer at the centre of the infosphere, the world of information, smart agency and smart processing. Today we'll be asking the question, how can humans thrive when our machines are smarter than us? And we'll be joined by an expert on the topic, Dr. David Weinberger, who has authored several books, including Too Big to Know, and a real authority on artificial intelligence. My name is Seb, and I'm a member of the team here at the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the world's largest online festival of ideas that explores the question, what if we could redesign everything? And we really want you to join in with this conversation. We'll be talking with David over the next 45 minutes. We want your questions, your comments and your feedback. And there are three main ways that you can give that to us. Number one is by using the actual comment space that's on the diff session page, just beneath the video stream that you're watching this on. You may need a 1 or 2 click process to access that, but it should be just accessible below that video stream. You can also feed in via live chat if you've made your way already to the YouTube page, and by tweeting us using hashtag ThinkDiff. I'm going to get to David in just one moment, but I'm also joined in the studio today by a man who probably doesn't need much introduction if you've been watching the Diff this year or over the last 4 years. He's known as the assassin of complexity. My colleague, Colin Webster. Colin, what are you looking forward to in this conversation?
I think for me it's just peaked. That introduction
that moment, yeah.
You've given me.
I wanted to give you that.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I'm really looking forward to hearing from David Weinberger about how we often hear about AI, about the terrible havoc it's going to wreak on our economy, and then ultimately destroying all of humankind. So I know that that's not necessarily it's not the position that David takes in his writing. So I'm looking forward to hearing how AI could be utilised to tackle some of the most complex challenges that we have.
And I think we all hope that David is right ultimately. So let's hear more from David. David, I wanted to start. I mean, you once wrote that our machines have knowledge that we'll never understand. How can we design something that we don't understand?
Well, it's machine learning in particular, and I should say at the outset a couple things. First, thanks for having me. Second is I am not an expert in anything. I'm a writer. I've been writing about this, but I have the privilege of hanging out with people who actually are experts, and I know the extent to which I totally am not an expert. I'm going to continue anyway. So the sort of AI that I'm particularly interested in is machine learning. And really the whole point of machine learning is that it programs itself to a large degree. And people who actually are experts in machine learning are now cringing when I say that, but let me put it forward as a very rough approximation. So as everybody knows, normally with normal computers, what we've been doing since the 40s, certainly the 50s, well, since the 40s, is that we build a computer and we program it. We tell it what to do with the information that we give it. And we build a logical model of the thing that we're interested in. So it might be your business, in which case the model is might take the form of a spreadsheet where we figure out what are the relevant pieces of data and how do they affect one another. If you increase the cost, then what effect is that going to have on revenues and the like. These models can be fairly complex and they work pretty well, which is what we've used computers for, but it requires a human to decide and figure out what the model is, what are the relevant pieces and how do they interact. The really incredible step forward that machine learning takes is that you feed it data and it figures out what the model is. This is an overstatement, but it's an overstatement that tends towards the truth rather than what's false. So you feed it lots and lots of images of handwriting is one standard example. You also, in this type of machine learning, you would tell it that here's one example, a scan of the letter A, somebody writing the letter A and the letter B and so forth. You give it tons and tons of these and it figures out from that how to interpret the next piece of handwriting that you put in. And it does that without having been told any rules. You don't have to tell it that an A, capital A, when printed is a pointy thing with a line, horizontal line, and then an H, it's, it's parallel and the rest of it. You don't tell it any of that. You show it images and it starts to figure things out. It has a different, and it does it without necessarily ever figuring out anything about pointy lines or horizontal lines. Same thing for the real examples of machine learning, which are all around us now. Google has declared that it is a machine learning company. Much, if not most, of what they do now is done this way, including. So when we fear the coming robot onslaught, we should also remember that we do get some things already that are not lethal, and that we use all the time, from the recommendations that we get from Netflix or Amazon, to navigation help that we get from Google Maps and the rest of them, to handwriting recognition, and tons of weather, is also computed to a large degree through machine learning algorithms, without ever having instructed the computer in what the model of how the atmosphere works. Now, it's actually a hybrid, but again, it's an approximation of the truth. So machines absolutely is the exciting thing about machine learning, is that machines can know things without our having given them the model to understand how things go together.
David, can I ask, I guess that thermostat on the wall behind you is another example of machine learning in operation, is it, in the Nest?
Yeah, it's a really simple one, right? I mean, it figures out from my manipulation of it what my desired patterns of on and offs are, setting heat levels, and it may discover patterns that I'm not even aware of. So, I mean, that's a really simple example, but absolutely.
But that gets to the heart of what you write about you not being aware of precisely what it is you need or want at any particular time, but the machine has picked up based on a bunch of patterns, in this case very simple, as you say, and is able to create its own idea of what works best for you.
Yes, but let me give you a more complex example, since you are the destroyer of complexity, as I understand it. So I've been told. So there is a machine learning AI system called Deep Patient that was developed by Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. And what they did was they took 700,000 patient records, medical records, fed them in, and let the machine churn away. It's a type of machine learning called deep learning. It involves multiple passes through neural networks, et cetera, et cetera. What comes out of it?
What's the neural network? Is that a bad question?
A neural network is a set of data points that are connected to other data points that have some correlation or relationship has been noticed in parsing through this data, some type of probabilistic relationship, so that the system has noticed that if this particular factor is at some particular level, there's a greater or lesser chance that some other factor, some other node is going to flip. And in this, it is patterned after the brain's actual neural network, although there's many questions about how close the similarity is, but at least as a metaphor, it seems to be pretty good. The important thing about the really important thing about neural networks, besides the results that they give, is that as with Deep Patient, it's gone through thousands and thousands of different variables that are in these medical records, all sorts of different pieces of data that the hospital has noted for patients over the years, and it has noticed correlations. And this would be really neat if the correlations were one-to-one, that it noticed, I'm going to make this up entirely, I don't know anything about medicine, if it noticed that if your potassium level is high, then you are more likely to develop schizophrenia. And schizophrenia turns out to be really hard to predict. That'd be really useful and really cool, but that's not the only thing that it does. It notices that there is some pattern, like a neural pattern, among 5,000 different variables that lead to some probability of 77% probability, given your particular data, that you are going to develop schizophrenia. And when you ask your doctor, and take it something you can do something about, like kidney disease or whatever, when you ask your doctor about that, The doctor says, look, it says there's a 77% chance you're going to develop kidney disease, and so here's some things we can do about it. And you say, well, why? What's the causes? The doctor, in some instances, because it's a neural network, the best that she's going to be able to say is, we don't know. We can't understand it. There are too many variables, and it may be that there's no one particular giant variable that correlates cleanly, like potassium. It may be that it's a configuration of 5,000 different variables that leads to this. And the only way that a human could understand it is to walk through all of those connections. So if this bit is turned, if this node is on, then there's a 77% chance that node B is going to be on. Now let's do this 5,000 times and for many, many thousands of connections. We simply cannot understand it. But we have evidence that it is in fact predictive. And this is amazing, because now there's a set of diseases we have not been able to predict for that we will be able to, and thus take corrective or preventative action for. But we do it at the expense of understanding. And so I'm sorry, I'm talking too long. I'll just get to what I think is, for me, the most interesting point, which is that this, in the machine's ability to hold thousands, tens of thousands of variables, and to hold them in complex networks of connections, we have reason to think that is a more accurate representation of how the world works than the very simple human explanations that we give one another. So this is a really alien form of knowledge, but because the predictions in some cases actually are, they work out, we have reason to think that it's a more accurate type of knowledge.
And can I ask this is fascinating to me. When I told my friends and family that I was going to be a part of this discussion, they said, well, how can humans possibly design something that's smarter than them? And I suppose what I'm curious about, you've sort of explained that a little bit, but what I'm curious about is, how did we just realize by accident that these predictions were suddenly happening in these machines that we'd made? Or did someone, create a piece of code that did this for the first time?
It has a long history. The capacity, that is, of feeding in data and letting the system analyze it, look for correlations. That's not terribly new. What's new is the capacity of the machines to do this, the processing power of the memory, the fact that they're networked, and that increases everything exponentially, and the availability of data, because we are sensoring up the world. They're sensoring with a S, not a C. We have sensors all around the planet, and including the nest. Sorry, pointing with the wrong finger. Can't tell. Left, right, reversed. Including nests, which I said it's learning from me about my pattern, but presumably Google, who owns Nest, is capturing all of everybody's data and figuring out broad patterns across entire populations and correlating it with who knows what. Why do some people keep their turn the thermostat down this much or that much under these or those circumstances? They undoubtedly are doing very advanced forms of analysis of that. So it's the presence of sensors, so much more data, and the capacity of the computers, and also computer science has gotten really, really good at this as well. This is a big growth field right now.
I guess most famously, machine learning in the public's eye shot to fame through, maybe not through Jeopardy, but through the, what do you call it, the Alphago machine. What's the story to tell behind the success of Alphago? What's so remarkable?
What's so remarkable about it is what's ordinary about this form of machine learning, but done in such a dramatic and convincing way. Because Go, the game of Go, is famous for being extremely difficult. Mathematically, it's incredible. It's like 70 orders of magnitude more complex than chess. I'm terrible at math, but something like that. The number of possible chess moves versus the number of Go moves is astounding. And players frequently, the best players, can't tell you how they came up with one move versus another. It seems so intuitive and so human, and so it's the sort of thing where you say, well, a machine will never beat it, except of course the machine did. So Google set up Alphago. They fed it something like 130,000 different games. That is all the moves. this is actually a good example of how machine learning, deep learning works, because if you were programming a chess machine, you would feed in the rules of chess, and then you would have it for any move, look at all the possible moves, some number of moves ahead, and figure out what the best move is. And AlphaGo doesn't work exactly that way. It's much less rule-based. It's looking at all of these games that have been played at the millions of moves that have been made in these, and using that simply to figure out, well, okay, then this move looks like the right one. And if you ask AlphaGo, why did you make that move? AlphaGo, you'd be in the same position as with Deep Patient. You'd be looking at some complex set of nodes connected, thousands and thousands of nodes connected with percentage weightings to each and many different configurations. We'd often cannot know why AlphaGo made that move, but it is defeating the world's best Go players. And it turns out developing a style of play that has the world's best Go players, I won't say mystified, because apparently they're learning from this, but it doesn't play the way a human does. It's astounding.
One of the themes at this year's DIF is this idea of complexity, especially in terms of actually our economic sessions, thinking about the economy in a more complex way than maybe traditional models do. You've said, I think both in some of your writing and also on the session, that the world is actually more like our machines understand it than we do. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, so that's speculative, but the test of our understanding, or human understanding of the world, is at least, does it work? Do we make accurate predictions? And whether that's some, predicting 10 years ahead economic activity, or what will happen when I stick this into there. And if we keep getting it wrong, then we say our knowledge is wrong. We have good evidence of that. Machine learning is making better predictions than we can. It enables us. So I'm going to give you an example. I hope it's a true example, but it should be. So it was only around 1900 that we humans figured out what the factors were that determined the weather for the next day. We were able to model the atmosphere using Newtonian physics for the first time. And we were able to do this because the person who invented it found 7 different variables of the air, the moisture and the heat and 5 other things. And you use those and you can make predictions. And weather prediction got better. But it was really stuck. It didn't get much better. When I was a kid, so I'm 67, so this is in the 50s and the 60s, and the weather forecast was famously it was better than nothing. But the true witticism was that if you simply predicted that tomorrow would be like today, you would beat the standard weather forecasts. That was being done on the basis of what humans can understand. Right? Seven different factors involved determine what the weather will be, and we can measure them and we can compute them. That worked to some degree. But we know that so much more is involved, that weather is incredibly complex. Everything affects it. It blankets the world, and everything on the world, on the earth, affects the weather to one degree or another. It turns out that that would require modeling every event in the world if you really want to get it down precisely. Instead, if you feed it in tons and tons and tons of data, we have lots of sensors doing this, the machines will figure out predictions that have gotten remarkably better, longer, and can forecast further ahead, and were more accurate in the short term as well, without our understanding exactly what all the forces are or why the predictions are being made that way. That's evidence that this form of model, this amazingly complex type of model that's not at all like a spreadsheet, not at all like the 7 factors from the 1900s that, for determining weather. It's not like that at all in terms of its complexity, its sensitivity to starting conditions, to the possibility of sort of cascades, of the butterfly effect, small change that cascades into something large, into a tornado, and is extremely hard to predict. That view of the world, the machine's view of the world, of so many variables, so intricately connected and so delicate in the outcomes, seems to me we have reason to think that it's a more accurate and thus perhaps more truthful picture of how the world is. Can I give you a different example?
Yes.
Not in machine learning?
The more examples, the better with this sort of topic, I imagine, David.
Well, we'll see about that. So let's say you want to see the next solar eclipse because you're a fan. And I don't know, let's say it's coming up in 2 years, and you book your tickets to the perfect Pacific island to see it, and you pay a lot of money, you arrive, you walk up the mountain, it takes 2 days, you got your backpack, you got your camera, you got your picnic, and it's all spread out, you got a bottle of wine you're saving, and you sit there, and it's a perfectly clear day, and you're really happy, and then 45 minutes before the solar eclipse, a single cloud emerges and moves right in the way and obscures perfectly your view of the eclipse. And you're really disappointed, and you spent a lot of money, and I'm sorry for you. But that's life. We say, well, what are you going to do? That's what we say, at least in America. At the same time, we know that the eclipse itself was completely predictable. We use Newton's laws. We know the position of the Earth and the Sun at one moment, and from that we can predict when the moon, precisely when the lunar eclipse, the next lunar eclipse will be, and also all lunar eclipses forever. It's as easy to predict the one in 10,000 years as it is to predict the one in 10 years, because you've got some basic facts and you got some formulas and you plug them in and you're done. So we have here two realms. We carry around with us a belief that is modeled on the eclipse, on sort of Newton's view of the eclipse, is also ours of how things work. That it's a perfectly orderly world that we can figure out by understanding the principles, and we have sort of the data to plug in, and we can figure out what's going to happen. At the very same time, we live in a world where virtually everything that we encounter is unpredictable. The cloud is unpredictable, but so is what color shoes you two folks are going to be wearing. I had no idea, or shirts. I didn't know that my tripod was going to fail or get in the way. I didn't know anything. I didn't know about the accident I almost had getting here. I didn't know what was. Everything that we encounter is accidental and is not predictable in the Newtonian sort of way. Yet we've still managed to think of the world as being governed by and being Newtonian in that sense. I think what's happening now, thanks to machine learning and to the chaos of the internet, is that we're learning, our focus is changing. So yeah, there are predictable events, and Newton was right. I'm not arguing against Newton, but we now have a lens and the ability to live in chaos and acknowledge it in a way that we didn't before the internet and before machine learning. So I think this is actually what I've been writing about, that our idea about how the world works and how the future happens are actually in flux right now. They're in transition from machine-like everything. We can predict it, we understand it, to one which accepts the truth of the world, which is in fact its chaotic nature.
It actually makes me think of something I was reading the other day about the Turing test, which is this, I guess, this quite famous test from the 60s that if you put an AI and a human in a room together and you can't tell the difference, then the AI has passed a certain test of intelligence. So I guess that kind of presupposes that the human level of intelligence is somehow a level of intelligence to aspire to for AI. Well, what you're suggesting is perhaps actually there's a different kind of intelligence that maybe has a greater understanding of complexity than humans can ever have, which is fascinating.
Yes, so I guess I'd be waiting for the machines to issue a machine test to see. By the way, I do not personally think that machines can be conscious. I'm not worried about that side of it. Doesn't mean they can't do evil things.
Well, that's very interesting.
I'm not worried about that.
So we're going to ask you a bit about some of the ethical and philosophical implications of some of the things we've been discussing in one moment, but I will just bring in the complexity assassin one more time, this time to diagnose the complexity of the diff and to tell us a bit more about what to expect moving forward and what people can catch up on.
Thank you, Seb. Yeah, I'm warming to this new job title you've given me. So let me just tell you, yes, this is one of something like 200 different sessions we've got running during the 3 weeks of the Disruptive Innovation Festival. And this one, like all the rest, are available to watch on demand. So if you don't manage to see them live, you can watch at your convenience. I'm going to tell you about just 2 sessions that I highly recommend that I think are, well, one's coming up on Wednesday and the other one is something you really should watch back. So the first one is called Designing the Regenerative City. We'll be broadcasting this one live from this studio at 11 a.m. UK time on Wednesday. It features the eco-architect Ken Yang, who's got a terrific vision for how our cities should look and of course for how some buildings should look. Really catch up with that one because Ken's got some fantastic imagery to share of real buildings he's designed and others that he has in mind. The next thing I want to talk about is a series of 3 videos that we produced and launched exclusively for the Disruptive Innovation Festival. Each of them explores the circular economy from a particular perspective. They're each about 20 minutes long. One of them I'll highlight just now. It's called A Flow of Wealth or A Wealth of Flows. And that features our very own Ken Webster, who will talk you through his vision of, in fact, a complex adaptive system is the exact model we should be using when it comes to designing our economy. And the final thing I want to say is simply that the Disruptive Innovation Festival is all about communication. So please do send in your thoughts and comments on Twitter using #ThinkDiff. Or of course, if you have questions for us that we can put live to David in this session, then use the comment section underneath the video you're watching this on. Okay, that's all catch up for now. Back to Seb with his big question.
Yes, philosophy and ethics. Actually, before we get on to philosophy and ethics, David, before we came online today, Colin and I did what any sensible person would do when they're about to interview someone, quite prestigious who's written a lot. We looked at you on Wikipedia, and we couldn't help but notice that at some stage you've been involved in, I believe, writing gags for a Woody Allen comic sketch. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about how your journey to this topic, I guess, is what we're interested in. How did you go from writing probably fantastic comedy about Woody Allen through to being a very well written author on artificial intelligence?
So this is actually an example, as I think everything is ultimately, why a metaphor like journey is inappropriate. It's something we impose on our lives when it's much more chaotic. And in this case, the chaos is relatively, straightforward. I was a philosophy grad student. That's when I had my PhD, and I'd been a freelance writer during this period and actually throughout my life. And I'd done a fair bit of freelancing of comedy stuff. One piece I'd written, because I like Woody Allen, but I was getting bothered by the pattern, the sort of the format, the 4 formats that he used. So I wrote up a parody called 50 Woody Allen Jokes and ended up sending it to his managers at the moment when they were looking for a ghostwriter for his comic strip that they were launching. So for 7 years, I was, I think, the major contributor of gags to that comic strip, which nobody remembers and nobody ever heard of. So who knew?
That we'd bring that up now.
Predict that.
Sorry. Okay, so on to philosophy, because you mentioned you're a philosophy student. I feel like artificial intelligence, so often depicted in our movies, our literature, our popular culture as a sort of menacing force, a threat to humanity. Humans in some ways, we're obsessed with our own demise, aren't we, in our popular culture. Is it reasonable to be afraid of some of the things you're talking about in terms of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, sure. There's many things to be afraid about with it. Much of it is being deployed against us in the form of commercial uses that do not align with our own interests. We know that humans are easily, it seems like the past 10 years with behavioral economics and the like, and nudges and the rest, what we've been learning, we're being told over and over, which I think is true, which is that we are way less rational than we ever thought we were. And we can be tricked. It's like optical illusions or brain illusions. Machines, AI can absolutely is being used against us in, somewhat benign ways. If you count, somebody targeting ads at us is certainly more benign than targeting weapons at us. And here's the trick with machine learning. Machine learning learns from data that we feed it. You give it lots and lots of health records, and it learns from those health records and so forth. But the data that we feed it inevitably reflects human biases. And so what it learns is very likely going to repeat and maybe amplify those biases. And there's a lot of work being done on that issue now. It's a very real issue. There are now sort of canonical cases, paradigmatic cases. For example, a sentencing system, a system that recommends sentences or what bail bond should be by looking at data from defendants. And it turns out unequivocally that the system has repeats in the U.S. racial biases. And that's just the most obvious. That's just the example that gets used over and over again because it's a really good example, but the phenomenon is very real. That needs to be addressed. The main way that, at least in my odd circle, that I hear the moral questions about AI being addressed is in terms of explanations. This is driven in part by the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, which goes into effect, I think, in May, and that it's a complex rule, but will certainly encourage, at the very least, and perhaps require that systems, machine learning systems that make decisions that affect people in important ways, that we be always able to explain how they're making those decisions. The always isn't quite right, but good enough for now. And so the obvious way of addressing this is to keep machine learning systems simple enough in their algorithms and how in their computations and the networks so the neural networks that they create to keep them explicable by humans. The obvious rejoinder to that is, well, if we do that, then we will lose much of the complexity that enables them to be smarter than humans. And there are lots of instances where we want them to be smarter than humans. So there's a lot of controversy about this now. There's an article I'm going to recommend called Accountability of AI Under the Law, the Role of Explanation. You can Google that, Accountability of AI Under the Law, that looks at this in some detail. And I'll say, from what I can tell as a writer, that it is uncertain. It's an object of controversy whether we can keep machine learning going at its exponential development rate in terms of the complexity, the amount of data, and so forth, and still keep its results explainable to the little tiny human brains that we carry around with us.
Can I ask a question about the legal side of things, David? I think you write about some of the ethical implications of using machine learning when it comes to, for example, working out what type of insurance people might need. And you maybe use the example of Episcopalians and Methodists, and you said, well, what if the machine makes connections and it says ultimately that people who are Methodists, for some reason that we don't understand, are less likelihood of contracting a particular disease. Should the insurance company charge Methodists more money for their premiums or not? I mean, that's the type of correlation a machine could come up with, but nevertheless, I think you wrote should never be used because of the legal implications.
I think it's a really hard question. And computer scientists working on machine learning, I think, also think that this is a difficult question. The problem is you put in all this data, and you can say, look, our society doesn't believe in discriminating based on race, on gender, on economic status, et cetera, et cetera. And it's gender, sexual preferences, we don't, et cetera. So we actually have a legal set of protected classes in the US. And so you can say, we're not going to put any of that, just scrub that data out. We don't want those decisions made. Now, you may not want to scrub it out of a medical record because there are things, medical conditions that affect women that don't affect men and vice versa, like pregnancy. But you may want to drop it out of most of your data. So good, that's fine. But what you're likely to find is you're still going to get results that reflect, say, gender bias, because there are so many proxies for gender, so many things that correlate with gender, that it shows that the machine picks up on it. And as you start trying to figure out what's causing this gender bias, and you start eliminating more and more classes of information, that may well work, which would be great, but it may also mean that the accuracy of the predictions go down. It's a really, this is a sort of problem that, first of all, you do not want to leave simply to the software engineers. You don't want to leave it to the Googles or to the companies that are selling sentencing software, because our interests are not entirely aligned. But you do want to pay a lot of attention to, and I don't know what, I know that we do not want to allow, say, gender bias to infect the decisions being made by machine learning systems. I know that it will unless we do something, but I don't know what we do or how likely it is. I will say this, one of the questions that should be asked is not simply, is this gender biased, but is this more gender biased than what we're getting from humans? There was a paper done not too long ago, research done that said that while the sentencing, and I hope I'm getting this right, that while the sentencing system is clearly racially biased, its results actually were less racially biased than what was coming out of human judges, because judges, even, we're humans. We carry this stuff around sometimes in subtle ways. I think asking, is this a step forward, is an important question. Not simply, is this perfectly what we want?
I'm sure I heard that.
I don't know. It's a very serious and deep and hard problem.
I'm sure I heard that judges tend to give harsher sentences just before lunchtime when they're hungry. So I guess
that's correct.
I guess we eliminate that problem.
There's good evidence for that.
Yeah.
Which machines, that's something you lose with machines because they tend not to get hungry.
You mentioned there that it shouldn't be just software engineers or Googles who make the decision over what type of data we feed our machines. Who's currently involved in those conversations, and who should be?
This is as broad as, these questions are as broad as any in our culture, because machine learning is going to affect almost everything, from education to traffic routing to medical, to you name it. There's somewhere in here, wherever there's a computer, there's going to be some machine learning involved in it at some point, because this stuff works better. So it's like asking who should regulate computers. And the answer is, well, lots of different people, depending upon what we're exactly trying to regulate. So if you take autonomous vehicles, for example, which will be self-driving cars, which are going to learn in a machine learning sort of way. The easy part is we do not want the manufacturers doing that, setting the priorities for those machines. So let me tell you one approach that I sort of like, that I've been arguing for. Rather than always insisting on explanations, because that, I'm afraid, may keep machine learning stupider than we want it to be, stupider than it can be, less accurate and helpful. Instead, think about regulating what these systems are optimized for. So what are you going to optimize autonomous vehicles for? Well, you might say, first thing is they should kill as few people as possible. Second, they should injure as few. Third, they should have the least environmental impact. Fourth, they should get us to where we're going quickly. I don't know what else, but make it up. There's some set of optimizations. The people who decide on that are, I would guess, the same people who decide on optimizing the highways. In the U.S., during the gas crisis, oil crisis in the 1970s, the federal government dropped the speed limit on national highways to 55 on the grounds that would optimize the highway system for gas savings. It hurts the optimization of it for getting places quickly, and that's a perfectly reasonable decision. And it's made by the right, it was made by the right authority in that case. If you are in a town, if you're in a city and you're trying to figure out how to optimize your city for autonomous vehicles, you're going to have the same sorts of decisions as optimizing it when you put in bike lanes. You say, we're willing to cut out a lane of traffic because we want to optimize for bike lanes or for above ground mass transit. These are political decisions that occur at every level of the country and internationally. And I suspect that because machine learning is going to touch so much of our lives, that those decisions will be made by the same sorts of bodies. Better than having the vendors do it, the manufacturers.
So we've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience I'm going to get to now. If you do want to try and sneak your question in, we've got a few more minutes here. Use hashtag ThinkDiff on Twitter, or post it in that comment space just below the video stream. We've had a question from Jennifer, which I think is maybe in this philosophical and ethics space. She asks, how futuristic is what we're talking about here? Are machines already smarter than us, which I think you've already sort of suggested they are? And is there an unlimitedness to AI?
Well, so the computer you carry in your pocket is full of AI, and you use it every day. Sometimes you sort of know it, sometimes you don't. Google search, all the search engines, all the mapping engines, the type ahead recognition, if you do any translation from language to language, that's all machine learning. So and that's just the beginning. So it's already here, and you're very happy with it. Generally, we all are, because it works really, really well. How far can it go? We're right at the beginning of this, and the amount of progress that we're making is incredible in every regard, including in trying to make systems more explainable. But what we will also see, however, is increasingly machine learning systems will be using output from other machine learning systems. So if you have a navigation system, if you're Google Maps and you want to get people places, it's, I think, almost inevitable that that system will be taking the output from weather systems. And those weather systems are machine learning, and they will be integrated perhaps into the streetlight systems, or street cleaning systems, or trash pickup systems in a city, or and the transit systems. So as these things get interlocked and become more and more useful to us, they become increasingly more ubiquitous. Well, they can't be more ubiquitous, but they become increasingly more complex and more widespread. And I think that's going to happen.
Had a couple of questions in, one from Emma, one from Mike, that sort of relate to this data point. You mentioned your Nest Wall device and the algorithms that companies use in terms of ads. We might have slightly provoked this conversation because we did have a session earlier in the diff with Jonathan Taplin called Move Fast and Break Things, where he sort of calls out some of the tech giants for monopolizing markets and utilizing our data in this way. I think when we titled this session, how humans can thrive when machines are smarter than us, a lot of people immediately think about robots and AI from the sort of science fiction movies. Is this different kind of algorithmic data? Is that what we're really talking about and have been talking about in terms of AI and both the opportunities and the risks? And you mentioned consciousness. I guess one of the users has asked a question around, will AI get consciousness, which you sort of mentioned earlier. You don't think it, that's not something you're personally concerned about.
So we worry about robots, that is, physical machines, because they can do us physical harm, and we should be. I mean, we want to make sure our machines aren't killing us. But we also should be, and I think the AI community is quite worried about about the role of AI outside of physical robots, where if AI is being used to evaluate job applicants, who gets it on in-person interview, and it's gender biased, as it will be unless we do something, unless we're really careful about it. That also affects our well-being really directly. So we should be concerned. We should also be hopeful, because this stuff can be tremendous for us. And I'll give you the very brief reason why I'm not worried about consciousness, actual consciousness arising. Information is a symbol. It's sort of the reading on a dial. That's what the information is. And if you make a symbolic representation of a human brain with ones and zeros standing in for actual neurons, that cannot, I think that cannot be conscious, because the symbols that you're using only have meaning because we intend them that way. Can I give you a 30-second example?
Absolutely.
Okay, so imagine there's 100 billion neurons in the brain. So imagine that there is a dust cloud out in space somewhere. It's 100 billion, and some of them are pieces of dust are turning clockwise and some counterclockwise. And if we say that clockwise means on, and other way means off, then we can look at that dust cloud, and maybe for 5 minutes, it's absolutely tracking the 5 minutes when, I'll use myself, when I fell in love with my wife. I looked at her and I fell in love. And just by coincidence, it's a big universe, and it's just by coincidence. But there is no possibility that, even though that dust cloud is a perfect model of the state of my brain for those 5 minutes, with the ons and the offs for each of the 100 billion neurons, there's no possibility that that's conscious. Because I could just as easily say that counterclockwise means on and clockwise means off. It's me intending those things, to take it as a symbol and to give that thing its symbolic meaning that lets us say, oh, it's conscious. But it's not. It's symbolic. I don't think symbolic things can achieve consciousness. I think brains with stringy neurons that are analog, not digital, by the way, can achieve consciousness. Maybe some other forms, maybe non-carbon form, but I don't think symbolic machines, symbol processors, can be conscious. That's my argument.
Can I come in with one final question, please, David, before we have to say goodbye, which is this, in a bite-sized response, what gives you optimism that machine learning is here to help us solve some of the most intractable problems we have?
What gives me optimism is the fact that it is solving a bunch of problems that we thought were entirely intractable, because their subject matter is so complex and so sensitive and involves so many variables, we simply couldn't manage them. That gives me tremendous optimism, and the hope comes from the fact that our concerns about AI are growing in parallel with the advance of AI itself. We're not entering into this blindly. Everybody who I've ever met in this field is deeply concerned about issues of bias and fairness, and as well as accuracy.
Thank you very much, David, for joining us this evening. Thank you very much for Colin for joining me. And thank you very much to our audience for joining us and for posting your comments and questions. I think the biggest takeaway for me has to be this idea that machine learning is here to stay. It's already transforming the world in a positive way, and it's doing it in a way that we can't comprehend. And maybe that's something that we should get a little bit more comfortable with, as David challenges us to do. I want you to do 3 more things as audience tonight. I want you to join the conversation tomorrow on #ThinkDiff. Tweet us your questions, your feedback, how you're enjoying the diff so far. Check out our diff on demand. We have something for everyone, I would say, fairly confidently at this point. And see what's on tomorrow. Colin gave you a nice list of sessions to check out. So thank you so much for joining us at this year's Disruptive Innovation Festival, and we hope to see you again in the coming 4 days.